The rain had a way of finding the cracks in old roofs, dripping in steady beats that felt louder when silence was already heavy in the room. Elena sat at the edge of her creaking bed, her hands wrapped tightly around a chipped mug of tea that had long since gone cold. Her daughter, Marisol, lay curled up under a patched blanket, her breath shallow with sleep. The girl's shoes, too small and worn through at the toes, were set neatly by the door, as though waiting for tomorrow to come with promises it rarely kept. Elena stared at them and felt pang in her chest. Winter was already unforgiving, and she had no money for new ones. She had stretched every shift at the diner, every tip folded carefully into her apron pocket, but rent had swallowed most of it. What remained went to food. There was nothing left for shoes, nothing left for warmth beyond the blanket she had sewn together from scraps of fabric neighbors once threw away. The wind pushed hard against the windows that night, and Elena thought about her choices. How she had walked away from a marriage that had left her bruised, how she now worked until her legs ached, how her little girl still smiled despite it all. Life was hard, yes, but at least it was theirs. A knock startled her. It was sharp, desperate, echoing through the thin wood of the door. For a moment, Elena froze, clutching her mug as though it could shield her from whatever waited outside. Knocks at night rarely brought good news in this neighborhood. She set the mug down and tiptoed across the cold floor, careful not to wake Marisol. Pulling the blanket from the back of the chair, she draped it around her shoulders and opened the door, just enough to peer through the crack. There he was, an old man, shivering under a tattered coat, his hair plastered to his forehead from the rain. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but only a faint whisper escaped. "Please." His eyes, tired and clouded with age, met hers with a mixture of shame and hope. Elena hesitated. She had so little already, barely enough to keep her and Marisol fed. Letting someone in could mean trouble, or, at the very least, one more mouth to feed when she couldn't even promise a full meal tomorrow. But she saw his hands raw and reddened from the cold, clutching his chest as though the storm outside might finish what hunger and exhaustion had started. Her heart clenched. She thought of her father, long gone, who had once told her, "Kindness doesn't come from what you have, but from what you choose to give." She opened the door wider. "Come in," she said softly, moving aside. The old man stepped in slowly, water dripping from his coat onto the worn floorboards. He looked around the small apartment, the single bed, the tiny stove, the peeling paint, and his eyes filled with something more painful than gratitude. He knew she didn't have much to give. Elena closed the door and guided him toward the chair by the table. She took the blanket from her shoulders and draped it over him instead. He looked at her with wide, almost childlike eyes, as if no one had shown him such kindness in a very long time. "I'll heat some tea," she murmured, already reaching for the kettle. As the water boiled, the old man's shaking eased just slightly. Marisol stirred in her sleep, and Elena glanced back at her daughter, wondering if she would understand tomorrow why their soup was thinner, why her portion smaller. She hoped she would. When she placed the steaming cup before him, his hands trembled too much to hold it steady. Elena wrapped her own hands over his, guiding the cup to his lips. The warmth returned some color to his cheeks, and for the first time since she opened the door, she noticed the lines of his face, etched deep by years of hardship, but softened now by tears that slid quietly down. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. Elena paused. She wanted to say she didn't know, that maybe it was foolish, that maybe she should have turned him away. But instead she said, "Because no one deserves to be out there alone." The old man lowered his gaze, clutching the cup as though it were a treasure. Silence filled the room, broken only by the storm outside and the faint hum of the kettle cooling. For Elena, the night stretched heavy with uncertainty, but in her heart she felt the faint stirrings of something rare, an act of kindness that cost more than she could afford, yet gave her a strange, steady warmth no fire could provide. The storm passed by morning, but the chill remained. The light that crept through the thin curtains was pale, stretching across the tiny apartment and settling on the man who still sat in the chair, wrapped in Elena's only good blanket. His breathing had steadied, though his eyes were open, staring at the floor as if wrestling with something unseen. Elena moved quietly around the stove, stirring the last of the oats into a thin pot of porridge. She measured each portion carefully in her mind, enough for Marisol, enough for him, and if she kept her own spoonful small, perhaps she'd get through the day until her evening shift at the diner. When she set the bowls down, Marisol's eyes blinked open. She pushed herself up, rubbing at her tangled hair, and stared at the stranger in their home. "Mama," she whispered, her voice still heavy with sleep. "It's all right, Carino," Elena said gently. "He just needed a warm place last night." Marisol studied him, her innocent gaze unflinching. Then, without hesitation, she scooted off the bed, grabbed her small spoon, and took a seat at the table beside him. "You can have some of mine," she said, pushing her bowl closer. The old man's lips trembled, but no words came. He looked from Marisol to Elena, as though unable to comprehend how both mother and daughter, who had so little, would give so freely. "Eat," Elena urged softly. "It's not much, but it will help." He nodded, slowly lifting the spoon. They ate in silence, save for the faint scrape of spoons against bowls. Elena watched him carefully, noting how he savored even the simplest bite. Hunger, she thought, must make everything taste like gold. After breakfast, Elena rose to prepare for work. She slipped into her faded uniform, tying the apron at her waist, and glanced back at him. "I'll be gone until late," she said. "You can rest here until then, but I don't have much else to offer." He opened his mouth, as if to protest, but Elena raised a hand. "Rest? That's enough." At the diner, the hours dragged. Her feet ached from endless trips between tables, her smile forced though her body longed to sit. Tips were light that day, people leaving behind coins instead of bills, but Elena pocketed each one carefully, the weight of survival measured in quarters and dimes. By the time she returned home, darkness had already swallowed the sky. She opened the door with a weary sigh, expecting to find the old man still in the chair. Instead, the room was empty. Her heart sank. The blanket was folded neatly on the table, and beside it sat a scrap of paper, the handwriting shaky but deliberate. "Thank you. More than you know." Elena sat down, staring at the note. She should have felt relief, one less burden to worry about, but instead, she felt an ache she couldn't quite name. She hoped he had found another shelter, some place warmer than her meager home. Days turned into weeks. The memory of the man lingered, but life pressed forward with its usual weight. Bills came due, cupboards emptied faster than they filled, and winter's grip tightened. Elena worked double shifts when she could, leaving Marisol in the care of a kind neighbor. Some nights, she returned home too tired to eat, her body collapsing beside her daughter's small frame under the covers. Then came the day she lost her job. It happened suddenly. Business was slow, hours were cut, and Elena, being among the newest hires, was let go. She stood outside the diner in the cold air, apron still in hand, tears burning her eyes. The weight of it pressed on her chest until she could barely breathe. How would she pay rent? Feed Marisol? The thought of returning to the abusive man she had once left clawed at her mind, but she shook it off violently. She would not go back. She would find another way. For 2 weeks, she searched. She walked blocks in worn shoes, filling out applications, enduring the sting of rejection after rejection. At night, she held Marisol close, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. The cupboards grew emptier, and the silence of hunger echoed through their tiny apartment. It was on one of those weary afternoons, when her hope felt thin as thread, that she heard another knock at her door. This time, it was softer, deliberate. When she opened it, her breath caught. The old man stood there again. He looked different, still weathered, but cleaner, dressed in a coat that actually seemed to fit. His posture was straighter, and though his eyes still carried years of hardship, there was light in them now. "Elena," he said, his voice steadier than she remembered. "May I come in?" She blinked, nodding slowly. Marisol, at the table drawing with a stub of crayon, looked up and smiled. "You came back," she said simply. The man stepped inside, removing his hat. He held something in his hand, a sealed envelope. He placed it gently on the table before Elena. I owe you more than words can ever repay, he said. When you gave me shelter, when you shared what little you had, you gave me more than warmth. You gave me a reason to keep going. I had been lost, but that night you reminded me of the goodness in this world. Elena's brow furrowed, unsure. You don't owe me anything, she said softly, but he slid the envelope closer. Please, open it. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. Inside was a letter and a check. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes darted to the number written there, a sum so large she could hardly comprehend it, more than enough to pay the rent, to buy shoes and food, to start over. The letter explained. The old man had once been a business owner, but after losing his wife, his health and mind had spiraled downward. He had abandoned everything, wandering aimlessly until the night she welcomed him in. Since then, he had slowly rebuilt his life, reconnecting with family, regaining strength. And now he wanted to honor the woman whose kindness had saved him from disappearing altogether. Elena's vision blurred with tears. She pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the weight of it. The man reached across the table, his weathered hand covering hers. You gave me hope, he whispered. Now, let me give you back the chance you deserve. For the first time in weeks, Elena felt her chest loosen, the crushing fear lifting just slightly. She looked at Marisol, who grinned with wide, innocent joy, and then back at the man whose life had touched theirs in a way she never expected. And for the first time in a long while, Elena allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. The envelope sat on the table for days, as though it carried not just money but a decision too heavy to lift. Elena kept glancing at it each time she passed, her stomach knotting tighter. The sum inside could solve everything: rent, food, even a chance for Marisol to have more than hand-me-downs and empty cupboards. Yet it also frightened her. Nothing in life had ever come easily, and she wondered if this gift was too big, too dangerous, too unreal. Marisol, of course, had no such doubts. Mama, she said one morning as she slipped her small hand into Elena's, you can buy me shoes that don't hurt my toes now, and maybe a birthday cake. Elena laughed softly, tears welling despite herself. Yes, mi amor, maybe even a cake. Still, she hesitated. For years, she had survived on the sharp edge of scarcity, always bracing for something to go wrong. To accept such generosity felt almost like stepping onto unsteady ground, as though the earth might give way beneath her. One evening, the old man, whose name she now knew was Samuel, returned. He brought a sack of groceries, the smell of fresh bread filling the tiny apartment. You haven't touched it yet, have you? He asked gently, nodding toward the envelope on the shelf. Elena lowered her gaze. It feels too much. Samuel sat at the table, folding his hands. Do you know why I gave it to you? She shook her head. Because you gave me what money couldn't buy. When I had nothing, no reason, no hope, you gave me kindness. You don't measure kindness by what you keep. You measure it by what you give away. His words settled into the room like a truth Elena had known all along but needed to hear spoken aloud. She looked at Marisol, who was happily buttering a piece of bread, crumbs scattering across the table. Her daughter deserved more than survival. The next morning, Elena made her choice. She went to the bank, hands trembling as she presented the check. The teller confirmed it without hesitation. It was real, every digit. With the first withdrawal, Elena paid the landlord, who looked surprised and almost respectful as he gave her a proper receipt. Then she took Marisol to a small store downtown. The child's eyes lit up as she tried on a pair of shiny new shoes, her toes wiggling freely for the first time in months. Elena bought them, along with a warm coat that swallowed Marisol in comfort. The sight of her daughter skipping down the sidewalk, her laughter rising into the crisp winter air, filled Elena's chest with something fierce and tender, relief. But Elena didn't stop there. Instead of spending recklessly, she sat at the table late into the night, a pencil in hand, sketching out numbers on scraps of paper. Rent, food, savings. She was determined not to squander the chance she had been given. For once, Survival wasn't the only goal. Stability was within reach. Samuel visited often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes simply to sit and talk. He shared stories of his late wife, of the business he once ran, of the mistakes that had broken him. Elena listened, realizing that behind his gift was a man still mending. Slowly, he became more than a stranger. He became a friend, even a grandfatherly presence to Marisol, who adored him. Yet even as life grew steadier, Elena wrestled with guilt. Why her? So many others in her neighborhood struggled just as much, if not more. One evening, she confessed this to Samuel. "There are children who go to bed hungry every night," she said quietly. "Mothers who can't find work. I feel selfish having so much now." Samuel leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "the best way to honor what you've been given is to share it." The words lit a spark in Elena's mind. She began setting aside small amounts each week, using them to cook extra meals that she shared with neighbors in need. She invited children over when their cupboards were bare, offering bowls of soup and pieces of bread. She fixed up discarded clothes, sewing patches with careful stitches, and gave them away. At first, it was small, just her kitchen, just a handful of neighbors. But word spread. People came, not just for food, but for warmth, for kindness, for the feeling of being seen. Elena's tiny apartment became a place of refuge, the way it once had been for Samuel on that stormy night. There were hard days still, days when the weight of responsibility pressed heavy, when the fear of losing it all returned. But now, Elena wasn't carrying it alone. She had Samuel's steady presence, Marisol's laughter, and a community that began to lean on one another in ways they hadn't before. And though she didn't know what the future would bring, Elena felt a quiet strength growing in her, one born not of what she had received, but of what she chose to give. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and with it, Elena's life seemed to open like a flower struggling through frost. What had once been a tiny, dim apartment full of worry now hummed with life. Children laughed as they came by after school, the smell of simmering soup filling the air. Neighbors who had once passed each other in silence now stopped to talk, to share stories, to help wash dishes or chop vegetables at Elena's table. What began as a simple act of feeding a few hungry mouths turned into something larger, something she never imagined she could create. People began calling it La Cocina de Esperanza, the Kitchen of Hope. It wasn't official, not yet, but the name spread like wildfire, whispered with gratitude. At first, Elena tried to keep it small, careful not to drain the money Samuel had given her. But something unexpected happened. Others started contributing. A woman brought over a sack of rice she'd bought on sale. A man who worked at the bakery left day-old loaves at Elena's door. Children whose families had little began offering what they could, a few tomatoes, an onion, a handful of beans. It was as if her single act of kindness had lit a spark that ignited in others. Where once scarcity bred silence and shame, now generosity created connection. Still, Elena worried. "This can't last forever," she told Samuel one evening as they sat together after the last dishes had been washed. "I can't build a future for Marisol on soup and hand-me-down clothes." Samuel studied her carefully, his eyes warm. "Do you think your future only depends on what you can keep for yourself?" he asked. She shook her head, unsure. "Look around you," he said softly. "You've built something far greater than security. You've built community. That is worth more than you realize." His words lingered, though Elena wasn't sure she fully believed them, until the day a letter arrived. It was hand-delivered by a woman in a crisp jacket, her hair pinned neatly back. She introduced herself as a representative of a local nonprofit organization that supported community initiatives. "We've heard about what you're doing here," she said, handing Elena the envelope. "Your neighbors nominated you." With trembling hands, Elena opened it. Inside was a grant, real, official, stamped and signed. Enough money to fund a proper community kitchen with supplies, tables, and even a small stipend for her to oversee it. Tears blurred her vision. She looked at Samuel, who only smiled knowingly, as though he had seen this coming all along. Marisol clapped her hands with delight. "Mama, We can make more soup for everyone. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. With the help of neighbors, Elena moved the project into a vacant storefront offered by the city at a reduced cost. They scrubbed the floors, painted the walls, built shelves. Donations poured in pots, pans, tables, chairs. For the first time, Elena felt not just like a survivor, but like a leader, someone who could shape not only her own life but the lives of those around her. Opening day was a celebration. Music played from an old radio, children ran in and out, and the smell of fresh bread mixed with the bubbling stew on the stove. Elena stood at the center, apron tied neatly, her hands shaking as she ladled bowls of soup and placed them on the long tables. "This is for all of us," she said quietly, though her voice carried. "Because none of us should have to face hunger or hardship alone." Applause filled the room, but what struck Elena most was the look on people's faces, the relief, the gratitude, the hope. She saw herself in them, remembered the fear of empty cupboards, the weight of loneliness. And in that moment, she realized the truth of Samuel's words. The greatest wealth wasn't in what she had gained, but in what she could give away. That night, after the last guest had gone and the kitchen was quiet again, Samuel placed a hand on her shoulder. "Do you see now?" he asked. Elena nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "I thought kindness was something small," she whispered. "But it grows, it spreads, it comes back in ways I never imagined." Samuel smiled, his eyes glistening. "And that," he said, "is the gift you gave me the night you opened your door. I just helped you see it for yourself." For the first time in years, Elena felt not just hope, but pride. She had built something lasting out of the simplest thing she had once given freely: kindness. Years later, the little storefront that had once smelled of fresh paint and stew had grown into something no one in the neighborhood could ignore. Elena's Cocina de Esperanza had become a hub of life. Meals served daily, shelves stacked with donated groceries, even workshops where mothers learned new skills and children found safe space after school. The walls held laughter, the kind that came not from abundance, but from the comfort of not being alone. Elena stood at the counter one afternoon, ladling soup into bowls, her hair streaked with silver now, her hands steady from years of repetition. She watched as Marisol, taller, older, full of confidence, helped a younger child tie her shoelaces. The sight brought tears to Elena's eyes, though she didn't let them fall. This was what she had always wanted, for her daughter to grow in a world where kindness was stronger than fear. Samuel was there too, though he was frilier now, his step slower. He came almost every day, sitting at his usual table near the window, a cup of tea in hand. He would watch the bustle, with a quiet smile, his presence alone a reminder of how it had all begun. One evening, after the kitchen had closed and the last pots had been scrubbed clean, Samuel asked Elena to sit with him. His voice was softer, his breath thinner, but his eyes still carried that same light. "You gave me my life back," he said, his hand trembling slightly as it rested on hers. "And look at what you've done since. You've given life to so many others." Elena squeezed his hand, her throat tight. "You gave me the chance," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, you gave me kindness when you had nothing. That is what built this. Never forget that." Not long after, Samuel passed away. The loss hit Elena and Marisol deeply. The kitchen felt emptier without his quiet laughter, without his stories. Yet, even in grief, there was gratitude. At his funeral, dozens of people came, neighbors, families, children who had grown up eating at Elena's tables. Each one carried a story of how Samuel had touched their lives, but always the stories circled back to the same truth. His life had been saved by kindness, and through him, kindness had multiplied. Years continued to unfold. Elena never became wealthy in the way money measures, but she lived with a richness that could not be counted. The kitchen thrived, sustained not by one person's gift, but by the steady rhythm of a community that had learned to give and receive. On her 50th birthday, the city held a small ceremony. Elena, embarrassed by the attention, stood on a stage as an official presented her with a plaque for her work in fighting hunger and building community. She looked out at the crowd, neighbors, friends, strangers who had become family, and saw Marisol in the front row, clapping with tears streaming down her cheeks. When it was her turn to speak, Elena's voice trembled at first, but then grew steady. "I don't deserve this alone," she said. "Everything you see here began with a single act. One night, in the middle of a storm, when I opened my door to someone who needed help. I didn't know then that kindness would come back to me 100 times over. But that is the truth. Kindness always finds its way back. Not in the ways we expect, but in the ways we need." The audience rose in applause, not for the plaque, but for the reminder she had given them. Later that night, as she walked home, Elena thought of Samuel. She remembered his frail figure at her door, shivering, asking for nothing more than shelter. She remembered the weight of that first choice to give when she had so little, and how it had changed not just her life, but the lives of countless others. And she understood more deeply than ever that the greatest power in the world does not lie in wealth or strength, but in compassion. It begins quietly with one person saying yes when it would be easier to say no. It begins with sharing a blanket, a meal, a moment of humanity. Elena turned the key in the lock of her apartment, now bigger, warmer, but still filled with the same spirit, and paused. She whispered into the stillness, as if Samuel could hear her, "Thank you for coming to my door." The moral had been written into every step of her life since that night. When you give freely, even from your emptiness, you create a fullness that can never be taken away. And with that, Elena smiled, knowing the circle of kindness would go on, long after her story was done.